The NRA scored a victory Thursday, and so did the First Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of the National Rifle Association against the state of New York, saying the state unconstitutionally tried to sideline any group that associated with the gun rights advocacy group. The court's ruling greenlights the NRA to resume its free speech fight against Maria Vollo, who worked for Governor Andrew Cuomo's administration. The NRA charged the former superintendent of the New York State Department of Financial Services of pressuring banks and insurers she oversaw to cut ties with the gun lobby after the deadly 2018 Parkland school shooting that left 17 dead.
In her opinion, liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor acknowledged Vollo had a right to criticize the NRA, but not coerce the companies she worked with and oversaw. She wrote in part, quote, "Government officials cannot attempt to coerce private parties in order to punish or suppress views that the government disfavors. Ultimately, the critical takeaway is that the First Amendment prohibits government officials from wielding their power selectively to punish or suppress speech. The decision makes clear to government regulators how much pressure they can exert on private companies that do business with controversial advocacy groups." So as much as, you look at the headline and it says Supreme Court sides with the NRA, this was a unanimous decision. It's not a right or left issue. If you don't want, a Republican official to wield their power and say, you know what, we're going to prosecute you unless you stop giving money to Planned Parenthood. If you're not okay with that happening, you have to not be okay with what happened in New York with the NRA as well. It goes both ways.
Exactly. And Maria Vollo was directly going after banks and financial institutions, saying essentially if they had any accounts with the NRA or if they facilitated donations to the NRA, that they were going to be sanctioned by the state of New York and face potential legal action. I mean, this was as clear-cut a case as you can ask for when it comes to the government violating private citizens and private businesses' First Amendment rights. The ACLU, which over the past 10 years has generally been believed to be arguing on behalf of more liberal causes, even actually argued the case on behalf of the NRA here. David Cole, who's the national legal director, said today's decision confirms that government officials have no business using their regulatory authority to blacklist disfavored political groups. They were clear that they sought to punish the NRA because they disagreed with its gun rights advocacy. I think the other benefit of having this be a unanimous decision is it really cuts against a lot of the recent claims that this court is illegitimate or basically incapable of handling its business. The fact that even with a conservative majority, this decision came out unanimously. They had Sotomayor write the majority opinion. Clearly, the Supreme Court is perfectly capable of doing what it's charged to do, which is uphold the Constitution and decide whether or not laws are abiding by its tenets.
Yeah, it seems that this case became significant because it was the type of situation where they weren't in cahoots completely with each other. There are definitely going to be scenarios where this still happens, but the trade is fair enough and they're like, okay, well, we did something really shady. We really don't want you to prosecute us, whether it's a big bank, whether it's a big insurer, a powerful company with a lot of resources. They might still make deals with people in government after this ruling and say, okay, if you won't prosecute me, I'll stop giving money to Planned Parenthood or whatever advocacy group it is. I'll stop giving money to the NRA. And if no one reports on it, if it never gets out, it can still happen. And so just because this ruling came out of the Supreme Court, it doesn't mean our government's rid of corruption, but it does mean that at least the Supreme Court sees corruption where it happens and agrees with us that it's wrong unanimously.
Yeah, another important case coming up that this could be sort of a predecessor to is Murthy versus Missouri, which is the case where a group of epidemiologists and people who were sort of on the opposite side of what the CDC was saying during COVID were censored by social media companies sort of at the behest of the Biden administration. That's going to be in front of the Supreme Court as well. They agreed to hear that case in October. They argued it in March. I'm not sure when their decision is going to come down, but it's not as clear-cut, I think, as the NRA case because there wasn't a direct threat of punishment like there was in New York. But the Biden administration obviously going to a social media company, which they are in charge of regulating, and of course, being the executive branch can exercise all kinds of power over these companies. There's an implicit threat there just by the government saying, hey, we think this is misinformation and maybe you should take it down. It's sort of a wink and a nod. I think the NRA decision suggests that the Supreme Court's probably going to come down on Murthy's side in this as well.
Absolutely. It's all giving Federalist 10 for me, which is a very nerdy thing to say, but in the writing of the Bill of Rights, when the framers and the founders looked at the Constitution, they decided maybe we need to write some more unalienable rights to guarantee to people who are citizens of the United States. There was a lot of back and forth about what to include and why. How do we guarantee liberty to the people living in the country many years from now? And in Federalist 10, there's this wonderful quote that liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. And I love that quote. And it's written in old-timey English, but I love the sentiment here. And it's that if we want to live in a free society, in a free country, there's going to be factions. There's going to be interest groups. And if we were to say there can be no factions, there can be no interest groups, you're infringing on people's political freedom and their ability to fully participate in the democracy in a way that they see meaningful. And so as much as we might say, oh, the NRA is getting so powerful, they almost have more power than a group of citizens of similar size because of how organized they are and how much resources go to them. And that can make you feel like, oh, do we have a functioning democracy when interest groups that represent, a minority have such a strong influence on legislation and our politics? But if we were to say there can't be interest groups, that's infringing on a fundamental freedom, and the consequence of that is almost greater than getting rid of this thing that feels like maybe sometimes is a threat to democracy.
Yeah, and I think people forget sometimes that for every interest group, there's probably an equal and opposite interest group on the other side of the issue, right? I mean, like when we look at big gas and oil companies and their lobbying groups, there is just as much money on the green energy side of the aisle. So, I mean, obviously not everyone is equally represented by lobbying groups, but it is the case most often that there's an equal and opposite group for each issue area. The other element of this that I think is interesting, just sticking with the gun rights portion of it, is that there have been some really shady government threats to gun owners under the Biden administration that go outside of the free speech realm. The Treasury Department under Biden in their FinCEN program has been tagging purchases that people have been making that they deem suspicious, whether it's a firearm purchase or even just shopping at an outdoor store like Bass Pro Shops, Cabela's. They've been searching people's transactions for the word MAGA and putting a flag on those. So they've been, in effect, suggesting that you could be affiliated with a domestic terrorist group or at risk of being an extremist if you make certain purchases. And it seems like this is well outside of the realm of what would typically be considered a national security threat when we're talking about looking at people's banking transactions. And to me, it seems intended to chill people who purchase guns or the companies that sell guns. We've seen a lot of companies actually move away from firearm sales in recent years, due in part a lot to anti-Second Amendment advocacy. And I think that's obviously a huge overreach for people to merely be exercising a right that they have in the Second Amendment and then find themselves at risk of government intrusion and spying just because of that.
Yeah, I will say that, these statements in Federalist 10 were far before the time we saw super PACs. And so, yes, there's usually equal and opposite interest groups, but sometimes there are very wealthy people lobbying the government in a certain direction. And I don't think the NRA is as big as the kids who are activists who are involved in the Parkland shooting or the many high schoolers who want to see gun reform. They don't have the same amount of resources or power. Like workers don't have the same amount of power as banks and corporations do in lobbying for deregulation and things of that nature. Getting money out of politics is important. Money aside, and just looking at the interest groups, it doesn't seem like a problem. But I think the key issue with that is that members of Congress can be bought and sold, and they should not be.
Yeah, totally. I think my closest analogous organization for the NRA would probably be Everytown for Gun Safety. I don't know if they get quite as much money, but I know that they're sort of equally as organized. But yeah, it's an important point. It's sometimes you have a hard time delineating between, is a politician receiving money from this organization because they vote in a way that this organization likes and they want them to keep doing it, or are they receiving money from this organization because the organization is actually trying to change the way that they vote? And it's not always easy to tell what is the cause and effect. Is this person really principled and they really support the Second Amendment, so they get money from the NRA because of it, because the NRA is like, hey, good job, we like you? Or is the person voting 2A because they received that money from the NRA? And sometimes it does seem like the easiest answer to not have to worry about what the correct cause and effect order is to reduce the amount of lobbying that's allowed in the U.S.
Yeah, that's really well put. We've got more Rising for you after this.